You've just decided that you want to buy a 50mm prime for your mirrorless camera. The question now is which one? And that's a tough decision because there are lots out there. Sigma has two 50mm mirrorless primes in its range, and here they are. The first one is the Sigma 50mm F1.4 DGDN Art, and the second one is the Sigma 50mm f2 DGDN Contemporary, and that sits in the I series range of lenses. So as you can see, size and weight are relatively different, the Art being quite a bit bigger and heavier, chiefly because it's got that f1.4 aperture compared to the f2 aperture of the Contemporary lens. So let's have a look at the features of these two lenses. So we'll start with the Art lens. As you can see, the Art lens has an aperture ring built in. You can hear that the action there, so it clicks nicely, it's got really nice action, or it can be declicked by flicking that switch, and then there is no click, so there is no stepped aperture if you use that switch. And that aperture ring can also be locked into either auto, so in other words you're controlling the aperture with the dial on the camera, or in manual, and that means that if you're in either manual or auto, you can't accidentally knock it into the other one, which is a useful little function. It's got a really nice grippy focus ring, so if you like to manual focus a lot, that's really nice. It's got the AF/MF switch there and an AFL button which can be customized to lots of different functions, so you can set it to ISO or AF tracking or whatever, depending on the camera that you're using. Yeah, very nicely built. It's partly metal, partly thermally stable composite, which is a polymer that we use to build lenses with. It's very strong and very sleek. Yeah, and it comes with its own lens hood, which is lockable, and there's a rubber bit on, so you can turn the lens, put the hood on and off very easily, so it won't come off until you press the button to unlock it, which is great. So very nicely built, and of course it comes with its front and rear caps. And in the box is a soft case, so yeah, just keeps it nice and safe if you're carrying it around in your camera bag, and it just needs a bit of extra padding. Okay, now the Contemporary one. So as I said, this is an I series lens, so that means it's an all metal build. So it's made entirely of metal. Even the focus ring is metal, and the aperture ring, which is awesome. And even the lens hood that you get in the box is made of metal. You can hear. They're all metal. So it's a really beautifully made thing. It feels almost sort of retro, kind of something out the 70s or something. It's really, really nicely crafted. It's got the aperture ring the same as the Art version, and a really nice clicking action, which also has the auto setting, so you can use the camera if you prefer. However, this aperture ring can't be declicked, and it doesn't have the lock switch. So that's two things to bear in mind. Where the Art lens has a slightly more advanced functionality. We've got the AF/MF switch there, which is yep, very nice action again. No AFL button on this lens like there was on the Art. So the Art lens probably has slightly more in the way of features, but the build quality is very, very good on both. I wouldn't say that because this is a Contemporary lens, it's any less premium feeling. They're both really beautifully built. One little extra that this lens has is that it comes with two lens caps. The first one is the standard plastic cap, which you get with every Sigma lens. And the second one is a metal lens cap with a kind of a felt kind of back, and it's magnetic. So it just sticks to the end of the lens. It's fantastic, beautifully made thing. So you can just hear, if I just put you by the mic there, just clips on and stays on. So that's the two lenses in a nutshell. So what we want to do now is find out how they perform, because we know what features they've got, we know what they look like, we know how big and heavy they are, but what are they like in the real world? What do they like to use? What kind of pictures do they take? What's their focusing like? What's their flare like? So let's go out and put these two to the test with a few little simple tests, just to try and give you guys a feel for which one of these might be right for you. But before we do that, I've got something to show you. Now, before we take any pictures, I just want to show you how we're going to take them. So we've got this this little rig made where two cameras are stacked on top of each other, and they're stacked really closely. They're almost touching, and they're so close, in fact, that when the two lenses are mounted, the 50mm f2 on the top and the 50mm f1.4 on the bottom, there's like 0.5 mil between them, so they are as close together as we could possibly get them. We'll pop these on a tripod, and the idea is that when we take pictures with these two lenses now, we're taking them from exactly the same position, the same tripod, the same place, and that just makes it a fair test. So we're not going to be kind of comparing two slightly different images taken from slightly different angles or slightly different places. These are taken from exactly the same position. And we've also got this this kind of little rigged up shutter release cable, which has got two output jacks, one for one camera, one for the other. And when we take that shot, these will fire at exactly the same time. And that's important too, because I didn't want it to be that I took a picture with one and then took the lens off and then put the other lens on, and then 20 seconds later the sun's gone in or the conditions have changed a bit or the light's changed. We know that they're taken at exactly the same time. So with all that said, let's take these two to our first location and run our first test. Okay, so the first thing that we need to look at when comparing really any two lenses is image quality, because at the end of the day, the image that comes out at the end of it is the most important thing. So we've got the two lenses mounted here. At the top, we've got the 50mm f2, so that's the contemporary. At the bottom, we've got the 50mm 1.4, so that's the art. And what we're going to be looking for is edge sharpness, we're going to be looking for chromatic aberration, we're going to be looking for colour accuracy. Okay, so as you can see, settings are absolutely identical on both cameras. So we've got manual mode, 80th of a second, f8, ISO 100, and then we've got daylight white balance, and the focus point you can see is exactly the same one on both screens, so it's focused over the top of that beach hut. So let's take that shot.
Okay, so here are the two images at f8, and let's take a look in detail at the steps in the bottom right of the frame. Even under close scrutiny, you can see that there's very little to choose between these two images and no clear winner.
Okay, so that's the lenses at f8, but we also want to test them at their widest apertures, because that's usually where a lens will show up a problem if it has one. But there's a bit of a problem here in that the lenses have different maximum aperture settings. One's f2, one's f1.4, and we couldn't decide kind of which was the fairer test really. Do you test them at their widest common aperture, which is both at f2, or do you test them both as wide as they'll go, so at f2 and at f1.4? So we're going to do both. So the first one, we're going to go to f2 on both. So we'll go to f2 and f2, and then I'll just balance up the exposure there with the shutter speed. So we'll go to, let's say, 1,000th of a second and 1,000th of a second, but other than that everything is equal. Let's take that shot.
At f2, the widest common aperture, it's pretty much the same story, with very little noticeable difference between the art and contemporary models.
Okay, and then we'll just set this bottom one, the art one, to f1.4, and then I'll just balance the exposure out a little bit. About there, okay, and let's take that shot.
Comparing the very widest apertures, f1.4 on the art and f2 on the contemporary, the f2 probably edges it just, with a tiny bit of extra detail, but we're not comparing like for like here, so I don't think we can really say one lens performs better than the other. I think what we can get from this is that whichever lens you choose, you can expect a very impressive optical performance at all apertures, even when cropping right in.
Probably the biggest difference in spec between these two lenses is the maximum aperture setting. On the art lens, it's f1.4, on the contemporary lens, it's f2, so quite a significant difference. And the advantage of having that wider aperture, the f1.4 aperture, is that you're going to get a shallower depth of field, so you get more background blur in your images. And also, it lets in more light, and therefore, if you're working in very dark conditions, you can get a faster shutter speed, and therefore are more likely to be able to handhold without blur. Now that second advantage is important, but these days cameras have very capable high ISO settings. So, you know, you can always turn the ISO up. You can still get those fast shutter speeds in another way, but the blur, the shallow depth of field, you can't achieve in any other way. That's baked into the image. You can't turn the blur up in processing, for example. It just, or not effectively anyway, it doesn't work. So for me, having that shallow depth of field is the more important advantage of having that very wide aperture. So let's take a shot. I'll just wake both cameras up. Okay, so as you can see, the focus point is right on the right hand side of the screen on the tree, so that's in sharp focus, and all the settings are the same: manual, ISO 100 and so on. But you can see there that the aperture is at f2 on the top one, that's the contemporary lens, and f1.4 on the bottom one, that's the art lens. So let's take a shot.
So looking at the two images, both have a very good degree of background blur, and on both the bokeh is very attractive. But there's no denying that at f1.4 there is considerably less background detail than at f2. If we crop in on a small section of the woodland in the centre of the image, on the f2 image I can see that there are 3 tree trunks next to each other, but on the f1.4 I don't think I can really make out that level of detail. So if a very shallow depth of field is important to you, the art lens is the clear winner here.
Next up, it's focusing. Now, I was initially going to run a test on which lens could focus the closest, so if you want to take macro style shots, but actually there's no point in that because they both focus at 45 centimeters. If you look at the spec panel, that's the minimum focusing distance. So there's no point in running that test, they're the same. But what is important is that we run a test on AF speed, so autofocus speed, and here's how the test is going to work. Both lenses go into manual focus, and we turn the manual focus ring all the way until both lenses are set at their minimum focusing distance of 45 centimeters. So the bridge will be out of focus. My hand would be in focus, right? It's just in front of the lens. Then we go back to autofocus on both lenses, and we set it to single point. We choose the same point, which is the one that sits over the bridge, and we're going to use our shutter release cable, of which the cables are the same length, and we're going to use all the same settings on both cameras. And I'm not going to take a shot. I'm just going to half press the shutter for both at the same time using the cable release until focus is acquired on both cameras, because I want to see which lens acquires focus fastest, given that everything else, the settings, the camera, everything is the same. Now that's going to be very difficult to tell because they're going to go beep at basically the same time, because you know all lenses are fast. So what we're going to do is we're going to film it in 100 frames per second, and then we're going to look at it frame by frame. So that's really slow-mo, and just work out which one just about beats the other. So let's get on with it. Before we start, I would say, if I had to guess, that they're going to be very close, even really slowed down. And the reason for that is that this bottom lens, the 50mm Art, has a new, or at least new at the time of filming, this was only the second lens to get this, it's the new HLA motor. So it's a new focusing motor. It's faster, it's smoother, it's more accurate, it's quieter than the stepping motor that's been used in all Sigma lenses until now, or at least all modern Sigma lenses until now. This top one has that stepping motor in it. So we've got the stepping motor versus the more powerful HLA motor. So you would expect that would win. However, we know from years of lens design and using lenses that the smaller the lens, the faster it focuses generally, because the focusing group inside the lens is smaller and lighter, and therefore the motor has to do less work to move it. So actually, I think those two things are going to cancel each other out. The faster and more powerful motor of this one will move the focusing group about the same speed, or at least it will get it to the point that it needs to be in about the same time as the stepping motor will move the smaller and lighter focusing group in this one. So I hope that makes sense. Let's see what happens. So the central focus point there is being used on both cameras, and we're just on the middle of the bridge there. So a nice high contrast point. to focus on. All the other settings are all exactly the same across both cameras, so we're ready to run this test. What I'm going to do then is, as I said, flick to manual focus on both lenses, and I'm going to go to the minimum focusing distance of 45 centimeters on both. Then we'll go back into autofocus on both. Okay, so now what we've got to do is just acquire focus at the same time, and we'll see which one gets there first. Right, so 3, 2, 1.
Now that was in 4 times slow-mo, but even then it's really difficult to tell. So let's go even slower and look frame by frame. So the Art lens at the bottom appears to get off to a faster start, but it's actually the contemporary lens that is the first to lock focus, with the green light showing in the bottom left-hand corner. Now let's see how many extra frames it takes the Art lens to get there. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so the Art lens was 4/100ths of a second slower than the contemporary. 3 things to mention here. Firstly, in real time, this is almost impossible to distinguish. So in real world shooting, we're talking the finest of margins. Secondly, this is the result for this particular scene and this model of camera on this particular day. It may well be that I could run the same test with different variables and get a slightly different result. And thirdly, we have to remember that the Art lens is at a big disadvantage because it's a bigger lens with heavier focusing elements. So you could argue that the fact it pretty much keeps up with the smaller contemporary speaks volumes about the speed of its new motor. Pound for pound, the HLA motor is the more impressive technology. So which wins? Well, on paper, it's the contemporary lens, just. But for a big F1.4 optic to match the speed of a lighter model is really impressive.
If you've ever taken a picture with a very bright light source in frame, usually it's the sun, you've probably noticed that you get some degree of flare in your image, where the kind of, because there's that bright light source there, it kind of bleeds out into the rest of the image, and you get a kind of wishy-washy, low detail, low contrast, low color image. Sometimes it looks really nice, and some lenses are built deliberately to have loads of flare in them, but for the most part, most lenses are designed to minimize flare as much as possible, and that is the case with all Sigma lenses, and they're generally considered to be very good at that. We've got a department in the factory in Aizu in Japan that's there specifically to stop flare. That's all they do, and they're very, very good at it. So what we want to do is test out to see how good these lenses are at controlling that flare. Now, if I look at the church tower there, it's really hard when the sun's in my eye to see any detail at all on the tower. I can make out like a window, and that's it. If I put my hand over the sun, I can see loads of detail. So we're going to run a test to see how these two perform. So we've got everything set up the same, everything's focused the same, all the settings are the same. Just going to move that slightly. Yeah, so we're focused on the church tower, and I can see the sun poking out. And I'm going to take a picture of both, and we'll see how much detail we can make out in the rest of the image. Obviously the sun will be all burnt out, but how does it affect everything else around it? So let's take that shot.
So here we have images taken with the sun just behind the church tower, just so you can see the scene without the bright light source. At the bottom, let's add the images with the flare. It's amazing how similar the flare is on these two lenses, given that they have completely different optical designs. In both images, I would say it's very well controlled, with plenty of detail and contrast in the building, and the effect of the flare is confined to a fairly tight area. For me, the performance is pretty much identical here, but if pushed, I'd say the contemporary just about has the edge here, with a slightly smaller artifact over the top of the tower.
So after all those tests, you can probably get a feel for the fact that these lenses are, in most regards, very, very similar in quality. The image quality, there's nothing to choose between them. The flare, there's very little to choose between them. The build quality, they feel so similar in terms of the quality of their build, the way the aperture ring clicks, the feel of the finish on the body. In terms of focusing speed, again, almost identical. So these lenses are so similar in so many ways, but there are some ways where they diverge, where they're not so similar. One is aperture. That one's f1.4, that one's f2. So that's quite a significant difference. So if you need that very shallow depth of field, or if you shoot handheld regularly in low light, then the Art lens is for you. If not, maybe the contemporary lens would suffice. Portability, clearly that one is quite a bit more compact. So if you're carrying it around all day, if weight's an issue, if you've got a kit bag full of other stuff and you just need something to squeeze in, maybe the contemporary is the better option for you. Price, the Art lens is a bit more expensive. Not a vast amount in it, but it is more expensive. So if budget is an issue, then probably the contemporary lens is the better option. And then features. The Art lens has a few extra features on it. It's got the declickable and lockable aperture ring, whereas the contemporary lens doesn't have that. It's got the AFL button that can be customized. The contemporary lens doesn't have that. And it's got the lockable lens hood that the contemporary lens doesn't have. Although that said, the contemporary lens does have that nice magnetic lens cap. So, I think it's horses for courses for me for these two lenses. I don't think either one is better than the other. I think they're just different. So I think the question probably for me isn't which is the better lens of the two, it's which is the better lens for you and the things that you're going to go and shoot with it. That's about it from me. I will see you next time.